So this happened a few years back, and I was around 17 at the time. I had just finished my shift at a local retail store, and it was around 7 p.m. You know, I live in the UK and it was winter, so it was already dark outside. I began my usual 15-minute walk home. On my way, I passed by a gym that's just a few minutes from my house. It's not the nicest place, but it's not too sketchy either. I've walked past it 1,000 times. As I was walking past the gym building, I heard some voices. These voices got louder as I got closer. So I turned left after passing the building and entered this dark cycle path. All of a sudden, the voices just stopped. I guess they must have heard my footsteps as I turned the corner. That immediately put me on edge. But you know, people sometimes stop talking when someone's walking by, so I just continued walking. In the dark, I could make out a couple of figures sitting on an abandoned stairway that leads to a blocked-off door. I kept walking, and they stayed silent. My social paranoia was just ramping up, combined with the natural fear of being out in the dark. And then, just after I passed them, I heard footsteps coming down the middle stairwell behind me. So, to not seem strange, I kept looking ahead and just kept walking. I tried to convince myself that it could be a coincidence or something, right? The footsteps, though. They kept following me in complete silence, getting closer and closer. Finally, I couldn't resist the urge anymore, and I looked back. What I saw was a stretched arm and a hand reaching out to grab me. It was just inches away when I sprinted off, still looking behind me. This guy, this older bloke about 40, yelled, "Come here, you little idiot." Instantly, I realized there was another guy who was far taller and slimmer, but was lagging behind. He never even attempted to run. Being a fit 17-year-old, I confidently slowed to a run. Adrenaline was pumping, but I managed to stay calm. The older guy kept shouting explicit things as I turned towards my house, and surprisingly, he just stopped chasing me. I made it home safely. The next day, I read in the local newspaper about several attacks in that area, including an elderly lady who got mugged after being put in a headlock. That's when it hit me. There are people out there who are just plain evil, preying on hardworking folks. So the lesson here is, if you ever feel like someone's following you, don't hesitate. Just start running immediately, even if it feels like a bit of paranoia. Worst case, you might look a little weird to a stranger, but it's better to be safe. It's easy to think about how you'd react in a similar situation, but it's a whole different story when you're actually facing it. I'll never know why the other man never tried to help his friend. Maybe his heart wasn't fully into it, or maybe he was just physically fitter than the main guy. They could have worked together and caught me easily. Years ago, I used to work as a stripper, and after about a year, I had developed a routine that helped me navigate the job. I worked at various clubs in the area, both day and night shifts, to maximize my earnings. Occasionally, there would be customers who got excessively clingy with one of the dancers, but usually security was there to maintain order, and we rarely needed their intervention. However, one night, a rough-looking man entered the club, and it was evident that he had singled me out as soon as he saw me. This wasn't unusual, and I approached him to make the most of his interest. We eventually went to the VIP room, and he got a private dance. During this time, he shared a bit about himself, and I, in return, provided him with a fabricated backstory. He mentioned he was a truck driver in town for only 3 nights a month. I discussed the other clubs I worked at, and it seemed like he might become a regular customer. Over the next 2 nights, he followed me to each club I worked at, and we went to the VIP room each time. However, he started to express a desire to rescue me from my current life, and suggested I should move in with him. I know this might sound creepy, and it definitely was, but it wasn't entirely unusual to hear such propositions from customers. After his 3rd visit, he disappeared for several weeks, apparently due to work. I almost forgot about him. When he returned to the club, I acted happy to see him, but I was already starting to feel uneasy around him. With each encounter, he became more physically aggressive and persistent about me moving in with him. Finally, I told him that I wasn't even attracted to men, and that I had a girlfriend, both of which were true. Unfortunately, this didn't change his behavior. and he continued to follow me from club to club when he was in town. After a few months of enduring this, I'd had enough. One night, he returned to the club and resumed his usual behavior. When I rejected his request to move in with him once more, he became aggressively insistent and began to frighten me. After that night, I tried to have him banned from the clubs I worked at, but it proved to be somewhat challenging. I attempted to switch up my shifts and clubs to avoid him, but he eventually tracked me down. One night, as I was finishing my routine on stage, I spotted him entering the club. I rushed off the stage as the song ended, but it was too late. He approached me, acting overly excited to see me, and started pushing me to leave with him. I declined once again, telling him my shift was ending and that I had to get changed. As I walked away from him, he literally picked me up over his shoulder and began carrying me toward the door. I screamed at him to put me down and tried to signal for help from anyone I could. When we were about 10 feet from the door, a security guard walked inside, returning from escorting another girl to her car. He immediately intervened, pulled me from the man's grip, and I ran backstage to get away from him. The security guard ejected the man from the club and threatened to involve the police if he ever returned. The man claimed he was just joking and not attempting to kidnap me. I waited backstage for over an hour before the security guard escorted me to my car. In the following months, I took time off from work because I was terrified of encountering that man again. I also informed all the clubs to tell him that I had quit if he called or showed up looking for me. Fortunately, this strategy seemed to work, and I never saw the man again. I continued working as a stripper for a couple more years before eventually transitioning to a different line of work. That's a true story that happened to me years ago. I'm from Germany and worked at an old people's home in a small German town at that time. The facility was in a rural area on the outskirts of town. One night, I had the night shift with a new coworker I had never worked with before. He was in his mid-50s, wore little round glasses, and for some reason, seemed a little strange to me at first. There were always only 2 workers alone in the facility at night, and our job was to watch over more than 100 residents in 100 rooms on 3 floors and make control rounds throughout the whole facility. We weren't allowed to use the elevators for security reasons at night, so we had to use the stairway instead. I remember the strange weather that night. It was stormy and wild outside when my shift started at about 10 p.m. By this time, most of the staff had left, and only one older nurse was in the station room on the 2nd floor, where we had our headquarters at night. She wasn't used to the newer PC programs and took longer to finish her paperwork. My coworker and I started our first round through the house, using the stairways with heavy doors that we had to close slowly and carefully to avoid noise. Everything was quiet. Most of the elderly residents were already asleep, and after we checked all the rooms, we sat down in the 2 end-floor station room to finish some paperwork. The old nurse had left, all doors to the outside were shut, and the house was completely quiet. After about 15 minutes of sitting in the quiet, suddenly, a heavy door in the stairway was slammed hard. We looked at each other without saying anything and immediately ran to the stairway. I went up to the 3rd floor, and my coworker sprinted down to the ground floor. We saw nothing and nobody. We even checked the stairway windows, and they were all closed. Someone must have been in the stairway, we concluded. As we found nothing, we continued our tour, starting from the 3rd floor down to the ground floor. From there on, I couldn't stop thinking about who the heck would sneak around the floors in the middle of the night. It was about 2 a.m. when we had to change the double sheets for an old, bedridden man who had wet his bed. I stood in the corner of the room beside the bed, backed up against the wall. My coworker was on the other side of the bed. I remember watching the door, waiting for someone to peer into the room. While I was concentrating on the door and lost in my thoughts, suddenly my coworker freaked out, screaming at the old man out of nowhere, ripping the sheets and tossing the old man around. His face had an angry, creepy look, and I was totally shocked and not able to say or do anything. I just watched this creepy guy in front of me with the totally dark windows behind him and the door leading to the dark floors where some creep had been sneaking around unseen. I stood there, pressed against the wall in the corner of that room, feeling totally lost, surrounded by psychopaths. We finally reached the ground floor, and everything was quiet, only the wind blowing around the house. Suddenly, we heard a dropping sound, like someone had dropped a knife or something metallic. The sound came from the kitchen area. We ran to the glass door, which was closed, where the sound came from. It led to a long, dark hallway with a back door at the end, leading to the trash cans in the parking lot. We opened that door and searched every single room. I felt extremely uncomfortable and expected an attack at any moment. Again, we found nothing. Some hours later, we started our last tour for the night. We split up this time, and I checked the rooms as usual. When I looked into one room, an old lady was awake and sitting on her bed. She asked me if I had been in her room 5 minutes ago. I said no, and told her that we had just started our tour. She said that 5 minutes ago she clearly heard someone enter her room. She asked who was there but didn't get any answer. Then the door was closed again. I got a creepy feeling while listening to the old lady. I told her to push the alarm button next time something like this happened again. I think it's unnecessary to say how I felt for the next few hours of the night, every time I entered a room or walked around a corner. I expected some stranger to be standing there all the time. I was more than glad when that shift was finally over. A few days later, I met the old nurse who left the facility late at night and told her the story. She said that the back door to the kitchen area was wide open when she went to her car that night. She reached the open, dark back door from the parking lot and called out if somebody was there. Suddenly, she got a very, very bad feeling, turned around, ran to her car, and drove off fast. She was totally scared and tried to reach and warn us but couldn't find the number. I told her that the back door was definitely closed when we checked the area. We never found out who the creepy person was who sneaked around there at night, and many night shift workers reported similar experiences in the following months. The co-worker I had to work with that night was fired after more and more complaints about his behavior emerged over time. Anyway, I'm glad I don't have to work there anymore, and will never do a night shift myself again. Hello everyone! If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful or entertaining, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to our channel. Your support motivates us to create more content you'll love. Thanks a million, and if you've just subscribed, please drop a comment saying I subscribed. We'd love to welcome you to our community.